All right, we are recording, and let me just turn it over to Karen Pagan, who's our Adult Ed Chair, for a minute to welcome, and then we'll get started. Go ahead, Karen.
Thank you. Adult Ed co-chair, actually, with
Right.
Dan Burchuk. But just a very quick welcome. I don't want to take up much time because I know I'm really excited to jump back into Spinoza. It was a great session last week. We're going to do things a little bit differently at the end of the rabbi's lecture. We're going to go into breakout rooms. So after that, you will be randomly assigned to one of 5 breakout rooms, and the facilitators have questions to start the discussion. Thanks again to everybody who's attending. Thank you to our anonymous sponsor of these 4 lectures, and to all of you who have made donations to the Adult Ed Fund to help us bring you lots of programs like this. I feel like I'm on PBS. Anyway, no further ado, Micah, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. This program has been sponsored by viewers like you. So welcome, everybody. It's great to see everybody out again this evening. And I'm going to share my screen, and we'll say the blessing for study as we usually do, and then we'll launch into our discussion. So wait, that's not it. One of these days I'm going to know how to do this correctly. Are you looking at the blessing for study right now? Okay. So please say the blessing with me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Eternal One, whose mitzvot make our lives holy and who commands us to study words of Torah. So last week we met Baruch / Benedictus Spinoza, who, as we've said, is a Jewish philosopher of the 17th century, but in many ways, well, we debated the question last week of, is Spinoza a Jewish philosopher? And we ultimately settled on yes and no. Because if you remember, in many ways, Spinoza's philosophy exists outside of Judaism. That is to say, he is a thinker of the century that he's living in, a thinker of the 17th century, a thinker of the early modern era. He places reason at the center. He believes in the scientific method, such as it is in the 17th century, and he believes that knowledge is found through the faculty of reason and through our capacity to explore the world around us. But at the same time, as we talked about last week, Spinoza is a Sephardic Jew who's influenced by the Sephardic Jewish tradition out of which he is born and out of which he comes. And his ideas, and we're going to see today, we're going to look at Spinoza's view of God, that the idea of oneness, which is so central to Judaism, is absolutely central to Spinoza's thinking. And there are certain elements of Spinoza's thinking that certainly are influenced by his Jewish background, and he has been quite influential on later Jewish thought as well. In fact, as we said last week, in many ways what Spinoza believes and what he teaches is in line with what a lot of liberal Jews believe and think today. But there was no such thing as liberal Judaism in the 17th century, and so Spinoza, rather than joining Temple Kolami or defecting to the Reform movement, was excommunicated from the Jewish community because he was seen as such a threat. So when we looked at Spinoza last week, we looked first at the life that he was living, and we saw that he's living in quite a tumultuous time. It's a time really of, I would say, both political and philosophical tumult, where there's a whole lot of war going on in Europe, but there's also there is a need to re-examine the bases of knowledge in Europe, where for a long time before, in what we call the Middle Ages, there had been an assumption that knowledge was gained largely through scripture and revelation. People in this century, and Spinoza is living around the same time as Descartes and Galileo, and a century after Martin Luther. And, so people in this era in which he's living are beginning to turn to science, to learn about the world around them. And they're also turning back to the philosophy of the Greeks, of Aristotle and Plato, in order to learn about the world around them. And so what we saw really was a young philosopher, and unfortunately he never lives to be anything but a young philosopher because he dies in his 40s, a young philosopher who is in search of both knowledge and fulfillment. And he asks himself in the treatise that we read last week, which is called the Treatise on the Inundation of the Intellect, he asks himself, is there anything more in the world than riches, honor, and sensual pleasure? Is there some good to which I can aspire? And he answers that the good to which I can aspire is essentially to learn about the world around me and understand the ways that I fit in to the world, that I am part of a larger whole, which he calls nature, and which, here's your spoiler alert for today, that what he calls nature, he also calls God. So what we're going to explore today is Spinoza's view of God. What was it that Spinoza means? What is it that he means when he talks about God? So I want to ask you, for those who have the handout, you can turn to page 7. For those who don't have the handout, I'm going to be sharing it on my screen anyway. So let me just turn forward here. So before we jump into this, let me ask you to do a little thought experiment with me. And I'm just going to ask you to put single words into the chat. We're going to do a little word association. When I say the word God, what words come to mind? You can put them into the chat. What words come to mind when I say God? So I see creator, infinite, one, Big Bang, that's interesting. Omniscient, religion, holy. Somebody said watchmaker, connection, guide, spirit. Love, unknowable. And together, I like this. This is a really interesting little thought. We should make a word bubble, those things that it shows all the words that we come up with. So it's interesting to note the extent to which, in some ways, we are products of what we'd call traditional religion, which is to say what the Bible has to say about God, and in other ways that we are products of what we might call modernity, which Spinoza is in the process of creating for us, so that when we associate God with omniscience, with prayer, we are in many ways drawing on our traditional Jewish views of what God is. Whereas when we associate God with the Big Bang, or with perhaps with connection between us, then we're calling on maybe something closer to what Spinoza might have had in mind when he thought about God. So I want to caution you right now about the text we're about to look at, because how many read this? How many read through this week? Some of you. All right. Those who read through it may or may not understand it any better than those who didn't read through it. But so what we're looking at when we see Spinoza is, if you remember, he's trying to work things out in what he calls a geometric pattern or geometric methodology, which is not to say that it involves actual shapes, actual geometry in that sense, but rather that it's mathematical in the sense that he's trying to derive statements, derive conclusions from axioms and definitions. So this will not look and feel a lot like Jewish philosophy. It might look and feel a little bit like logic, like symbolic logic for those who took logic in university. But it's incredibly interesting what he derives. So we're not going to read all of this. We're going to have to, because it's 17 pages worth. But I want to start with a few of his definitions, and some of these words are really important in terms of what Spinoza is trying to accomplish. And in particular, I want to look at these 4 definitions, D3 through D6. So I'll read them. By substance, that's our first definition, substance. I mean that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. That is, that the conception of which does not require the conception of another thing from which it has to be formed. This is medieval cosmological language that Spinoza is drawing upon. And so what is a substance? A substance, according to Spinoza, we might say, well, my water is a substance, right? Or whatever. There's lots of things that are a substance. He's not using the word in that way. A substance is something that exists not by virtue of the existence of anything else. So a substance is a thing that is not caused by or related to anything else, but that exists in and of itself, essentially. And we're going to see later on, he's going to say that a substance, its essence includes existence. So a substance is a thing that exists not because it was caused by anything, but rather because the very essence of a substance is to exist. So does this water exist independently of anything else in the world? Well, no. This water, first of all, it's broken down into molecules, and the molecules are broken down into atoms, and this substance exists in relation to the clouds in the sky and the tap that it came out of. And how did it get into this water? Well, I poured it into this bottle. Well, I poured it into this bottle. And so this substance exists in relation to lots of things. But, not this substance, this water. A substance, so says Spinoza, is something that is not caused by or related to any other thing. The spoiler alert here, and I'll give you this from the beginning, is Spinoza is going to argue that there's only one substance, and that substance is everything, the totality of everything that exists in the universe. That is the substance he's talking about. That's definition number one, but you don't know that yet. That's coming later. Definition 4, D4 here, by attribute, I mean that which the intellect perceives of substance as constituting its essence. So if you remember from Maimonides says that there are two kinds of attributes. There are attributes that are that are of the essence of the thing, and there are attributes that are secondary. Like, I have brown hair. Well, that's secondary. Not all human beings have brown hair. But all human beings exist, he says. And all human beings, this is Maimonides, all human beings are thinking beings. Those are of the essence of what it is to be human. Spinoza is using the word attribute slightly differently. For Spinoza, the attribute is only that which is of the essence of the thing. And there are actually only two attributes that are accessible to human senses. And they are thought and extension. Extension means essentially physical being. And thought is the idea of the thing existing, that there can be a possibility or a thought of a thing. So for example, I'll go back to this water. This water has physical existence. It has extension. There is also the thought, the notion of water, the idea of water. And so this water therefore has both thought and existence. It can be experienced in the attribute of thought and of existence. The same is true of you as a human being. You exist as a physical being. You exist in the attribute of extension, and you also exist in the attribute of thought. And for Spinoza, that's part of why you have a mind. Part of why you have a consciousness is that you exist, you can be experienced through the attribute of thought. Third definition that we need to look at is here, D5, what he calls a mode. By mode, I mean the affections of substance. That is, that which is in something else and is conceived through something else. So you remember that substance is that which is not conceived through anything else. A mode is that which is conceived through something else, that which exists as a part of a larger whole, essentially. So what he means by that, I know this is incredibly confusing. What he means by that is that substances can be essentially subdivided, or a better word for it, rather than subdivided, is it can be experienced through different modes. So if the substance is the totality of everything that is in the universe, then what are the modes of that substance? Each individual thing that exists in the universe. So that includes this water that I keep picking up. That includes my dog who just walked in here. It includes, well, actually, she just left now. She's quite an impatient mode of existence. That includes, the tree that I see out my window or the picture frame that's hanging behind you, and it also includes you. So you are not a creation. You are not a substance in and of yourself. You are a finite mode of existence as part of a larger whole. So essentially, those are the three major definitions that Spinoza needs us to understand in terms of how he's looking at the world around him. He understands the world around him as being a whole, a totality of existence that he calls a substance. And he's going to prove to us in the course of the next 10 pages or so that there can be only one substance. And he understands everything he sees around him as a mode of that substance, a piece of a larger whole that he calls nature, which for him is the same thing as God. I know I'm throwing a lot of weird philosophical language at you. Are there any questions? Is this kind of clear to everybody in the ways that it can be clear? We're going to skip the axioms. Yes, Stephen Phillips, it looks like. You can go ahead. Do you have a question?
It sounds very much as if it's the same thing as the definition in physics of that matter can neither be created nor destroyed.
Well, so Spinoza, of course, is living before modern physics. So he doesn't have Newton's laws or anything. We have Newton on here. I think Newton was born around the same time as Spinoza, maybe even the same year or shortly after. But yes, Spinoza does believe that substance is eternal. And this is an area of disagreement among philosophers. Does the universe exist eternally, or was the universe created at some point? So someone like Maimonides believes that the universe was created by God. It has a starting point. Someone like Spinoza believes that the universe exists eternally because substance nothing can be the cause of substance, essentially, because substance, which is God, is the cause of all things. So yes, he would argue that, and he would argue even more so that it's not only that matter can neither be created or destroyed, but that substance is infinite, both temporally and spatially, that it has always existed, and that it exists infinitely in terms of what the universe is. Now, we have modern science in a way that he didn't, so we may know different things about the universe than he knows, but he's using this really to define God. So let's go on and read some of his propositions and see what Spinoza learns, what he gains through this. So proposition 1 is that a substance is by nature prior to its affections. And when he says affections, he means the modes, the things that exist because substance exists. So that makes sense. That's evident from certain definitions. A thing can't exist before its cause, right? So the cause, the substance, is prior to, again, both temporally and existentially, prior to its existence, its affections, its modes. Proposition 2, two substances having different attributes have nothing in common. And that is true in part because if you remember definition 3, said that a substance is conceived through itself. Therefore, two substances cannot have any of the same attributes. They must be completely separate. And by proposition 3, when things have nothing in common, one cannot be the cause of the other. So by that, no substance can bring another substance into existence. A substance must exist by virtue of its nature, essentially. Therefore, if all those things are true, then proposition 5 must be true. In the universe, there cannot be two or more substances of the same nature or attribute, which is to say that no two substances can exist that have the same attributes. And remember that the attributes we're talking about are the attributes of thought, that is to say, existence in the realm of idea, and of extension, which is to say, existence in the realm of physical being, which means there can't be two substances that exist as physical beings, which means everything around us, both the physical things that we see around us, as well as the non-physical things like the laws of nature, the law of gravity, even though he lives before Newton's laws. That's the one I always fall back on, the law of gravity, the laws of nature. These cannot exist in more than one substance. There can only be one thing in the universe that contains all of these things. So we also, by proposition 7, existence belongs to the nature of substance, as we said before, that a substance by definition must exist. Now there's a little bit of circular reasoning here, because remember, he defined a substance essentially as something that exists, and now he's declaring that existence belongs to the nature of substance. So that's one of the criticisms that Spinoza gets thrown at him, that he defines something and then he actually proves that that thing is true by basis of the definition that he gave us. So we can criticize him by saying that. But at any rate, definition number 8, he tells us that every substance is necessarily infinite. And for this, I want to read the proof. There cannot be more than one substance having the same attribute by proof 5, and existence belongs to the nature of substance by proposition 7. It must therefore exist either as finite or as infinite, but it cannot exist as finite because, by definition 2, it would have to be limited by another substance of the same nature, and that substance would also have to exist. And so there would exist 2 substances of the same attribute, which is absurd. Therefore, it exists as infinite. Everybody got all that? If a substance was finite, that would mean that by definition, it was limited by the existence of something else. Part of the reason that this water is finite is because it is limited by the existence of other things around it. It can't be infinite because there are other things that limit its ability to exist. But if a substance was limited by another substance, that would mean that there was another substance that had the same attributes as that first substance. And we've already shown that that 2 substances can have nothing in common. Therefore, a substance is necessarily infinite. You see how he's using mathematical logic to prove what he wants to show. So before we look at proposition 11, I want to go back and look at one more definition, which is definition 6. So if you'll turn back with me, those who have the sheet, back to page 7, and that is his definition of God. Remember, we just proved that substance is necessarily infinite. By God, he says, I mean an absolutely infinite being, that is, substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essence. So Spinoza is defining God. Actually, following in traditional religious definitions, he is defining God as an infinite being. Spinoza's definition of God essentially hinges on the idea that God is infinite. So you can see now where this is going, that he's just defined substance as an infinite thing, and he's also defined God as infinite. So we now look at proposition 11. God, or substance, consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essence, necessarily exists. Spinoza has 3 different proofs for the existence of God. These are not necessarily the most sound proofs. Lots of people have poked holes in them. But here in proposition 11, he proves to us in 3 different ways that God, which is to say a substance consisting of infinite attributes, must exist. I'll read 2 of them and explain one of them. Proof number 1, he says, I like this. If you deny this, conceive if you can that God does not exist. All right? Go ahead. Everybody do that. Conceive in your mind that God does not exist. Everybody got that conception in your mind that God does not exist? Therefore, by axiom 7, God's essence does not involve existence. But this is absurd because he's already defined God as the totality of all these things around us. And look around you. It exists. Therefore, God must necessarily exist. Because we could also say you were able to conceive in your mind that it exists. And because it existed in your mind, therefore the idea, it exists in the attribute of thought. Therefore, it's impossible to say that it doesn't exist. Again, you can poke holes in his theories, but this is what he's arguing in terms of the existence of God. Proof number 2, which we won't read in its entirety, sounds something like, if a thing doesn't exist, there must be a cause or a reason for it not existing. And if there was a reason for that thing not existing, then such a reason would have to exist. And if such a thing exists, then there must be existence. There must be substance, which includes the attributes of reason and thought, or which includes the attribute of thought. So therefore, if you can come up with a reason that God doesn't exist, then something exists, and that something is part of substance, which is God. The third proof, which he'll give us, I will read this one. To be able to not exist is weakness. On the other hand, to be able to exist is power, as is self-evident. So if what now necessarily exists is nothing but finite entities, then finite entities are more potent than the absolute infinite entity, which is absurd. Therefore, either nothing exists or an absolutely infinite entity necessarily exists too. But we do exist, either in ourselves or in something else which necessarily exists. Therefore, an absolutely infinite entity, that is to say God, necessarily exists. What Spinoza is doing here, which actually does relate to modern physics in some ways, is to essentially say all these things around you, they are not things in and of themselves. They are part of a larger whole. They are connected to each other, and they exist in relationship and by virtue of the existence of something larger. That's actually, from a scientific perspective, that's actually true in many ways. You are not an independently existing thing. Even though you might feel like an independently existing thing, you're actually made up of many things that of many things that exist in the universe. You exist by virtue of the existence of all these other things. Spinoza's point is essentially saying we are all part of a larger whole. And since he's labeled that larger whole as God, therefore, God necessarily exists, because it would be absurd to think that I exist, but there's nothing larger that I am part of. All right, Proposition 13, I'm going to go through a few more propositions, then we'll talk about the meaning of all this. Proposition 13, he believes that absolutely infinite substance is indivisible. Now that's interesting because he's already said that substance can exist in modes, right? You're a mode of substance, I'm a mode of substance, my water and the tree are modes of substance. So what does it mean then for a substance to be indivisible? What he means by indivisible is not that it can that you and I are not separate entities, because in a sense we are separate entities. What he means is that we are part of this larger whole, that if you look at the proof, if it were divisible, the parts into which it would be divided will either retain the nature of absolutely infinite substance or not. In the first case, there would be several substances of the same nature, which is absurd. We've already proven that. In the second case, absolutely infinite substance can cease to be, which is also absurd. So when a thing comes into existence in our physical reality, it doesn't come into existence as an independent entity. It comes into existence as a mode of the larger substance that exists. But substance as an entity, substance as an existent thing, is indivisible in the sense that I cannot not be part of substance. I am not an independent being. I am a finite mode of being. I am a finite mode of substance, which leads us to proposition number 14. Now, Maimonides, who we learned about a few months ago, and Spinoza are trying to solve the same problem. And the problem that Maimonides and Spinoza are trying to solve is as follows. If God is infinite, which is part of the traditional definition of God, if God is infinite, then how can the world also exist? Maimonides solves that problem, if you remember, by essentially saying something that sounds like God is infinite and God is completely separate from the world, completely separate. The words that we use to describe ourselves and the world around us don't even relate to God. When we say God is wise, we don't mean the same thing because our words don't describe God. When we say God is great, we don't mean that God is the greatest on the spectrum of how great we are. God is something completely outside and separate from the world. God's existence doesn't even mean the same thing as existence when it comes to us. Yes, of course, God does not exist. Maimonides says, if you remember, Maimonides says we can't say what God is, we can only say what God is not, essentially. Of course, God does not exist. But that doesn't mean that God exists in the same way as we do. That doesn't mean that God is wise in the same way that we are. And the reason for that is because the attributes of existent things and the attributes of God cannot be the same. No two substances can have the same attributes. That's how Maimonides solves the problem. Spinoza solves the problem in a different way. He solves it through Proposition 14. Excuse me. There can be or be conceived no other substance but God. So if God is infinite and we also exist, Spinoza says that must mean that we are in God, that we are a part of God, because God is the totality of everything that is. God is this infinite thing that exists in the world. And if we also exist, then there is no logical explanation other than that we exist in God. And he says here in Corollary 1, and here we get a little bit of a sense of his Jewish roots. Hence, it follows quite clearly that God is one. That is, in the universe, there is only one substance. And this is absolutely infinite, as I have already indicated. So for Spinoza, the oneness, the indivisibility of God is absolutely central. And that's quite a Jewish idea. Because, of course, what do Jews say twice a day? Adonai Echad, God is one. And Spinoza essentially challenges that idea to its logical extreme. If God is one and God is infinite, then how can there be anything besides God in the entire universe? Therefore, by Proposition 15, whatever is in God, and nothing can be conceived without God. So let me read this proof. He says, apart from God, no substance can be or be conceived. That is, something which is in itself and is conceived through itself. Now, modes, remember, we're the modes, right? Modes are pieces of existence. Modes cannot be conceived without substance. Therefore, they can be only in the divine nature and can be conceived only through the divine nature. But nothing exists except substance and modes. Therefore, nothing can be conceived without God. There is nothing existing other than substance, which is God. And everything that we know is a mode of that substance, which is actually quite an amazing idea. You are a mode of God. You are a part of God. You are you might say an attempt or an experiment or a mode in the existence of this vast thing that is nature or the universe or God. I see the Vanix hand up. Go ahead. And then Phil.
Okay, so Rabbi, based on Proposition 15, is he then proving that God created the world as we know in Genesis, all the animals and creatures and everything that's in it, night and day, etc., 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 and us?
So, no, he's not. And the reason is because the way you just described it, Joy, makes it sound like God is something other than the animals and us and everything that exists. If God created all those things, then God stands outside of those things and makes them come into being. What Spinoza is actually saying is that God is all of those things. God is the totality of all those things and more. That all of those things exist as a part of God. And as we're going to see in just a moment, God is not, and actually this next paragraph is important for that. God is not a being who has a will or a body or does things per se, except through the laws of nature. So Spinoza has essentially declared that God is nature. God is nature and only works through the laws of nature. So if by that you can say God created me, then yes, God created me because through the laws of nature, I came into existence, and so did you, and so did the tree, and so did this water. God is the creative force behind the existence of all those things, but God is not outside of those things. God is the forces by which. And so it's good for me to clarify two things. Spinoza divides nature into two parts. I know he just said it was indivisible, but he also divides it because he can do that. He's a philosopher. And those two parts are essentially the active and the passive parts of nature. He calls it natura naturans and natura naturata. Natura naturata is it the present participle or it's the past participle? That is nature natured. Nature which is natured. For those who speak Spanish, any Spanish speakers here, this is the ado form in nature, naturado, that is to say that which has been natured. That's what is brought into existence. Natura naturans, which we would call naturing, the active forces within nature, that is the forces which allow things to be brought into existence. So we might say the laws of gravity, the laws of physics, the laws of nature, those are the active forces within nature that bring into existence things like trees, mountains, water, and me, right? So those are the things that get natured, whereas these are the things that nature. At one point in his career, Spinoza sees God more in the active forces of nature. He's essentially saying God is the laws of nature that allow things to come into existence. He later kind of moderates that and says, no, God is all of it. God is every single piece of it. But God is God is essentially existent in the creative forces in the universe, which I guess, Joy, is my way of saying to your question, yes, God did create all those things, but not as a supernatural being, simply as the laws of nature that allow for those things to come into existence. So I see Phil, and then I see Karen.
I guess, I don't know if I can articulate this properly. If his definition of God is basically everything in nature, then that means that God is all the good and also all the bad, so that evil is part of God as well. So then if that's what he believes, what's the point of being good? That wouldn't make you more holy or more godly. Being evil would be just as holy and just as godly.
Yep. So we're going to get into that toward the end here, Phil, once we sort of dispense with this entire definition. But Spinoza struggles with that. Well, I don't know if he struggles with it. Other people struggle with what Spinoza has to say about that, which is to say, here's the preview. Spinoza says that good and evil are subjective. He says that things that are good are basically things that are good to us, and things that are evil are basically things that are evil to us or bad to us or harmful to us. So he's not necessarily believing in an absolute morality. He does, however, believe in a kind of ethics, which essentially sounds like all things want to continue to exist and be their best. And by reason, if we are following the faculty of reason, we also want that for each other. So the reason to be good, by that definition, is because it's reasonable, because I reasonably want the best for you and you reasonably want the best for me. But the idea that there is an objective good and evil is not part of Spinoza's system, which, by the way, is one of the things that got him excommunicated from the Jewish community and banned by the church, because he was not saying that there is absolute good or objective good and evil.
So how would he explain an evil person? Because that's not a person that wants the best for you. Right?
Yep. So he would explain that by saying two things. First of all, Spinoza believes that we are all the product of our causes. He's actually a determinist. He does not believe in free will, which again we'll get to a little more deeply later. Spinoza believes that everything works according to the laws of nature, and that includes us. So it's interesting, he may not be wrong. Science, and I'm not a neuroscientist, but from what I've read and what I understand, there is some evidence for the idea that what you do is actually caused by chemical processes and neurological processes that are in turn caused by things that happen to you or things that shaped you, etc. So Spinoza would argue on the one hand that everything that people do is shaped by the causes that come before them, that we are the product of our causes. He would also argue, though, on the other hand, that in the context of the system in which we're living, in which you and I don't know what's going to happen. So even if it is predetermined, that doesn't mean I know what's going to happen, or that you know what's going to happen. That in that context, we do have a kind of will, a kind of free will, or at least a sense of ourselves as having free will. And that, remember from last week, the greatest good, as far as he's concerned, is to explore the universe and understand it through the faculty of reason and through science. And that reason will lead us to want the best for each other. So that evil person, the person that you're terming an evil person, Phil, essentially is the product of many causes. That person behaves in that way because of all the things that have led them to do that. And at the same time, because they have not yet developed the faculty of reason enough to understand that, in order to want good, to want what is good for others. I believe that's how he'd answer it if he were here.
But he would be totally against punishing evil people.
Well, yes and no. So that's one of the questions in our breakout rooms today, right? How can people be held accountable? He essentially argues that, that things are determined by causes. But that doesn't mean, though, that within the system that we live, where we don't have knowledge of what will happen, it doesn't mean we don't have the ability to determine, or to determine what those causes are to some extent. So, if I'm an evil person sorry, that's not a good, I don't know if he would use that language. If I make a harmful choice, and that choice can be traced to to my upbringing and my trauma and what I had for breakfast yesterday and the fact that I'm in a bad mood, those are causes. But there are also other causes in my upbringing and in my trauma and in my love and in my connection with others that could lead me to behave in different ways. So people are not absolved of responsibility for their actions, because none of us can fully map out all of the causes that lead us to behave in certain ways. We're so complex, I believe Spinoza would say, that we actually essentially have a version of free will, even though ultimately he believed, along with his time, they believed in that time that everything could ultimately be explained mathematically through causes, like algorithmically. I see Karen, and then Saul, and then Vanix. And then I want to actually get more deeply into some of these questions that are being asked. Go ahead, Karen.
I have a question about the first corollary. If you can just scroll up a little bit in Proposition 14. So in the universe, there is only one substance, and this is absolutely infinite. What's the difference between the singular substance that is God and the universe? Nothing.
They are synonyms for the same.
Okay, so the language is just a little bit confusing there. So probably if you took out the preposition in, it would make more sense. The universe is only one substance.
That's right. Yeah, I guess when he says universe, he means, existing. There is only one substance. Yeah, I believe there is no difference between the universe and the substance. The universe is the substance, and the substance is nature, and nature is God. There's only one thing that exists.
Thank you.
Saul, go ahead.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around whether his argument would still hold if he didn't use the term God and just talked about nature or substance or natural law, and whether talking about, so I don't know what God adds to his argument, and whether talking about God is required, because of the context in that time, you probably, he would be seen as even more heretical if that was possible, if he didn't use that language, which people could at least relate to.
Yeah, so that is exactly the question that was raised of him, and that people have been asking for 400 years. Was Spinoza an atheist? Does Spinoza call it God because the language of his time refers to God? But does he, by saying God is everything, is he actually also saying God is nothing? I think we can ask Professor Rosenthal that question when he joins us in 2 weeks, but I suspect he'll also say something like, that's what everybody wants to know. And so Spinoza was accused of atheism, but how can he be an atheist if he's just proven the existence of God? But your point, Saul, is exactly how he can be accused of atheism. If God is everything, then God is nothing other than everything, right? Which means that if everything's already accounted for, then what's God? Maybe there is no God. This is the danger that somewhat a later thinker like Hermann Cohen sees in Spinoza. Cohen, who lives in the early 20th century, is a liberal Jewish thinker, and Cohen believes that God is the ground of morality, of ethics, that God is the source of right and wrong. The problem with right and wrong, as Phil pointed to, is that if God is simply the totality of everything that is, then there's no right and wrong necessarily in that. Arguably, we could argue differently, but that it's possible that you need something outside of nature, outside of something of what already is. That is what Cohen calls the ought, what ought to be, as opposed to what is. That's where God resides. That's what Cohen says. Spinoza says, no, God is simply the totality of all that is. So a moralist like Cohen comes along and says, if God is what is, and there is no possibility of better, there's no command to do or be better, then that's no God that I believe in. But that is exactly what you raised, Saul, is exactly the criticism that's raised against Spinoza. Schweitzer's and Vennick's, and then I'm going to go a little farther. Go ahead, Schweitzer's.
So your comment of how could he be accused of being an atheist when he's proven the existence of God? But that's exactly why the Jewish community and the Catholics or Christians no longer accepted him, because his view was just so outside and so outlandish and so, I don't know, scientifically trying to prove. So I won't accept that he isn't, maybe he's not an atheist, but I don't think he speaks for most beliefs of God.
And yet he's not the only pantheist. There are mystical pantheists. There are Kabbalists who say God is the totality of everything that is. What Spinoza does differently is to prove it mathematically. And Spinoza's, his moral ideas are problematic for the Jewish community, right? But Spinoza is not the only person to say God is simply the totality of all that exists. And here, look at this scholium. Vanix, I see you, but let's look at this first. He's polemicizing against others who would see God in supernatural or human type ways. I'm right here. He says some imagine God in the likeness of man, constituting of mind and body, and subject to passions. But it is clear from what has already been proved how far they stray from the true knowledge of God. These I dismiss, for all who have given any consideration to the divine nature deny that God is corporeal. God can't be a person. They find convincing proof of this in the fact that by body we understand having some quantity, having length, breadth, and depth, bounded by a definite shape. And nothing more absurd than this can be attributed to God, a being absolutely infinite. If God is infinite, he said, then God can't be any one thing. God must be everything. That's the definition of infinite. If not, God's not infinite. And if God's not infinite, then God is limited, and that can't be God, says Spinoza. At the same time, I'm right here now. Now he's going to polemicize against Maimonides. At the same time, however, by other arguments, which they try to prove their point, they show clearly that in their thinking, corporeal or extended substance, remember extended means physically existing, substance, is set completely apart from the divine nature. And they assert that it is created by God. That was Joy's question earlier. But they have no idea from what divine power it could be created, which clearly shows that they don't know what they are saying. So that's his polemic against Maimonides. You're going to tell me that God and creation just exists, but we don't know anything about it? Remember, that is exactly what Maimonides says, that Maimonides believes in mystery. Well, Spinoza believes in knowledge. Spinoza believes that the laws of nature are evident to us if we simply learn, if we study, if we use our faculty of reason, and we use the scientific method. We can learn everything about everything. You're going to tell me that God exists and works outside of that in some mysterious way that can't be proven or disproven. No, I believe in what I see around me, and I believe there's meaning to what I see around me beyond the simple fact of existence. All of this is God, he says. Peter and Joy, go ahead.
I'm wondering how much science Spinoza actually knew. And the reason I ask that question is because he says that this thing or this concept that he's labeled God or nature or existence is infinite. But there's a scientific axiom that says you can't have more than any posits that God is one because of this. Well, you can't have two infinite things because by definition, not his definition, but by definition, infinity is everything. It's there's nothing more. There cannot be anything more than infinity. So why does he go to all this trouble? If he's going to why didn't he just simply posit that there is infinity, God is infinite, therefore, nature is infinite, because at least in our realm of knowledge it is. Therefore, nature must be God, and vice versa.
I'm not sure I understand. To me, that is what he's saying, essentially.
Yeah.
I think
I guess my question is, why does he go through all these crazy machinations in order to get there?
Oh, well, I mean, because I think he feels that he's proving it. He's proving it absolutely. Remember that he's following on Descartes. Descartes is the I think, therefore I am guy. Remember, I'm going to throw out all knowledge except what I can prove. And the only thing I can prove is that I think, therefore I exist. And from that, I'll build my entire system. Well, Spinoza is doing something similar. He's proving this based only on what he believes he can prove incontrovertibly, right? So there's a series of axioms, which we didn't look at the axioms, but an axiom is something that is true in and of itself. And from those axioms, he lays propositions on top of propositions. So he is doing what you're saying, Peter. He's just doing it in a more complex way, which is in line with the kind of logic and the kind of philosophy of his time. So that is pretty much what's going on here. So let me add a couple more points, and then I want to talk, although you all actually already anticipated some of the harder questions I was going to ask today, but we'll get a little more deeply into that. So in Proposition 16, I'm on page 14 here. He tells us that he essentially, this was Joy's question earlier. He essentially tells us that based on everything we've learned, God is what we would call the first cause. This is Aristotle's language, by the way, God as first cause, the cause of everything. God is the thing that causes everything else to come into existence. In fact, as it says here, from the necessity of the divine nature, there must follow infinite things in infinite ways, modes. That is, everything that can come within the space of the infinite intellect. So everything else that can exist does exist following from God's existence. And remember, that means not only physical things, but also ideas, laws of nature, anything that can be conceived is conceived as part of God. And importantly, in Proposition 17, God acts solely from the laws of God's own nature, constrained by none. Nothing can act on God, because nothing else exists in order to act on God. There is nothing outside of God, and God therefore acts only from the laws of God's own nature, which Spinoza would say is important because can the laws of nature part the Red Sea? Can the laws of nature cause the sun to stop in the sky? Can God act outside of the laws of nature? No, he says, God acts only within the laws of nature. Those are the ways that God acts. Go ahead, Carla, I see your hand.
something in Proposition 17 that made me sit up and like go, whoa, I couldn't believe he was saying this. It's later on. He says, if the essence of the one, he's talking about if there were two things that existed like, and similarly, he says, if the essence of one could be destroyed and rendered false, so too would the essence of the other. And I'm thinking, oh my God, quantum relationships. He's not even, like, he's centuries and centuries ahead of himself. But he's saying that that couldn't be.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'd have to find out. I'm not sure exactly. But he
The
does.
second last paragraph of Proposition 17.
Oh God, it's so long. Well, let's put a pin in that and come back to it. And maybe you and I will take it offline because I want to see exactly what he's saying there. If that's okay with you, Carla.
Yeah.
Alex, go ahead.
Thank you. So just 1 second. Let me mute the phone. Thank you. What you have said about God acting solely within the laws of nature, because technically God is nature, precludes absolutely every miracle and everything that is written in the Bible as such, right?
Right.
And also, I'm wondering if the creation of the world from Spinoza's perspective was seen as a violation of the normal laws of nature. This would be an interesting subject as well, but probably too long to debate, because at his time, the knowledge of physics was extremely small to envision the creation of the world as laws of nature. So from that perspective, Aristotelian views of an infinite universe, or infinitely from a temporal perspective, would be better suited to him than that of the Bibles.
Yes. So to your first point, yes, Spinoza denies the possibility of miracles. And we're going to look next week at his reading of the Bible. Spinoza anticipates what we today call biblical criticism, which is to say the Bible was written by people and represents what people thought happened, as opposed to being the written word of God. So to us, that might sound secondhand. Of course, the Bible was written by people and anticipate and it reflects what people believed, but nobody was saying that yet then. Spinoza is one of the first to say that, and his ideas about God actually lead him to believe those things about the Bible and about religion, which is part of why I say that Spinoza is in many ways a Jewish philosopher, because Spinoza is anticipating and in some ways kind of creating what we call today liberal Judaism. He's calling for a critical reading of the Bible. He's calling for a notion of God who works within the laws of nature. He's saying that there are no supernatural miracles. Those are things that actually parallel what some liberal Jews believe today. And in that sense, what Spinoza believes is not outside of Judaism, except that in his time, there was no one else saying it, and it did get him kicked out of Judaism. So that's your first point about miracles. Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
The problem with that is that if God is infinitely, represents infinitude, it's infinitely powerful. God's self can also violate the laws of nature, because what precludes? Otherwise, God is limited by the laws of nature.
Right. So that's your traditional "can God make a rock that God can't lift" question, right? Because is God so powerful that God can create this rock? But if so, then why can't God lift it? Spinoza essentially posits that God is not omnipotent, omnipotent. God is not all powerful in the sense that God can do whatever God wants. But that's because, see, there was something I skipped over that I wanted to read that had, oh yes, here's what I wanted to read about that actually. Because you're thinking of God wrong, he essentially would say. You're thinking of God as a person who does things and who chooses things. But Spinoza doesn't believe that. Where is it? Corollary 1. I'm going to find it. I'm on page 14 at the bottom. Sorry, 15 at the top. We'll read the scholium. Others, he says, take the view that God alone is a free cause. So the question you're asking, Alex, is doesn't God have free will? Can't God do whatever God wants, and by that, can't God make a work outside the laws of nature? Can't God split the Red Sea if God wants to? Isn't that the definition of a free thing? But Spinoza has defined freedom differently. Spinoza has defined freedom, and here we have to go back to our definitions. Here, turn back with me to page 7, those who have the sheets in front of you, and let's see what it means to be free. That thing, this is D7, that thing is said to be free, which exists solely from the necessity of its own nature, and is determined to action by itself alone. A thing is said to be necessary, or rather constrained, if it is determined by another thing to exist and to act in a definite and determinate way. So Spinoza essentially says what it means to be a free thing is to not have anything outside acting on you. God, his version of God by definition is nothing outside of God works on God, constrains God in any way. But the laws of physics teach us that all things exist and act according to their nature. So therefore God also must exist and act according to God's nature. And God's nature is the laws of nature. Therefore God is a free thing because nothing acts on God, nothing forces God to do anything. But God still only works within the laws of nature because that's simply the nature of things. Nothing exists or acts outside of its own nature, including God. And God as nature cannot act outside of God's own nature, essentially. Anita, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, could Spinoza argue that even though miracles didn't exist, they could be explained as being part of nature, that nature has its own anomalies? And
yes, if they can be explained by the laws of nature. So, could the parting of the Red Sea? Yes, he actually says something like that. We'll talk more about this next week, but he says something like that every miracle that's ever in the Bible is introduced by nature of its cause. An east wind blows and the Red Sea parts. So clearly it was the wind that somehow parted the sea. I don't understand how it worked, he says, but that's how it worked. It wasn't God doing it from outside of the laws of nature. It worked from inside the laws of nature. Because Spinoza does, interestingly enough, believe that the Bible is largely a true narrative. He's not yet late enough in the evolution of biblical criticism to be able to say maybe a lot of it's made up. He believes that it's basically true, but that it has to be true within the laws of nature. It never occurred to him that maybe there is no parting of the Red Sea. He just thinks the parting of the Red Sea is somehow naturally explicable, essentially. So here, look with me back at page 11. The scholium toward the top of the page. Sorry, not page 11, page 15. The scholium toward the top of the page, and we'll see that what he means by God is actually quite different than what we mean. Here, I'm right here. Others take the view that God is a free cause because, so they think, he can bring it about that those things which we have said follow from his nature, that is, which are within his power, should not come about. That was your question, Alex. That is, that they should be produced by him. But this is as much as to say that God can bring it about, that it should not follow from the nature of a triangle, that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles, or that from a given cause the effect should not follow, which is absurd. If can God make it so that a triangle doesn't have 3 sides? Well, no, that's not a triangle anymore, he essentially says. So therefore, God also can't make it so that God acts outside the laws of nature, because that's not how God works. Furthermore, and this is a really important point, I shall show later on, without the help of this proposition, that neither intellect nor will pertain to the nature of God. So this is a really important distinction between how Spinoza thinks about God and how others might think about God, which is to say that God is not a being who wants things or thinks things or desires things. God is the totality of all the causes that exist in the universe, but not a person, not a being who wants. He uses the word being, but God does not have a will. So you have to stop thinking of God, he says, as being someone who did something, and rather think of God as the totality of everything that is, and as essentially the sum total of all the causes and forces and things, both that which acts and that which is acted upon in nature. So let me quickly, I see Don's hand now. So Don, go ahead, and then I'm going to quickly sum up with a few important questions. And then, if we still want to do this, we'll break up into breakout rooms to have a discussion about some of this for, let's call it, for our last 15 minutes or so. Dawn, go ahead.
So I'm curious as to where prayer fits into all of this, or if it does at all. If people, if man and woman and people or whatever are all part of God, do we pray? I mean, I'm to say I'm confused is an understatement.
I understand.
But at the same time, if we have God, if God exists in its totality of everything we know, is there room for prayer in this construct?
So if it's okay with you, I want to save that for next week, because that's actually the topic. Next week's topic is about religion and religious action, religious text and action. What is the Bible, and what is religion? And I think you can get a sense already that he doesn't believe that God hears our prayers and acts according to them, right? So then the question is there a purpose to ritual? Why do I light the candles on Friday nights? Why do I pray? Are any of these things worth doing, or do I throw them out? And he's anticipating the discussions that reformers will have later on, right? Because the idea that God doesn't work outside the laws of nature is not foreign to liberal Judaism. Not that all liberal Jews believe it, but many liberal Jews believe it, that God does not work outside the laws of nature. And if that's the case, why say Mishaberach? If God's not going to heal my grandmother based on my prayers, then is there a point to praying? And so let's put a pin in that if it's okay with you, Don, because it's a really important question and it deserves the full discussion that we'll give it next week. Alex, go ahead.
Thank you. There's another aspect that I believe someone mentioned in a comment and prompted my imagination. If we are all part of God, to some extent, our death diminishes God a bit, and a birth increases it, and which is contrary to the concept of infinite extension. So is that something that preoccupied Spinoza, or is that irrelevant?
No,
and the other thought that I had was something that Phil raised with regards to good and evil. If good and evil are all part of God, why bother being good or not committing evil acts? But somehow societies need to exist, being them part of God. And one of the rules of society is that whenever, the right of the individual to not be harmed by another, that is difficult to glean from the theory in which God is everything, but somewhere it has to be discussed. Otherwise, Phil's point remains unanswered.
Right. Good question. So you actually have anticipated page 17 of our sheet here, because these are the questions that.
Sorry, haven't read it.
No, that's great. These are the questions that get asked. So your first question, Spinoza would answer that the birth of a person does not augment the existence of God, because what we are is a mode of God. We are a mode of existence. We are a part of God, but it doesn't mean that what I am is a finite mode. So put it this way, what is infinity plus one? It's infinity, right? So adding something to something infinite doesn't actually make it larger. And infinity minus one, I think, is still infinity also. I'm not a mathematician, but the point is that by adding or subtracting a finite mode within the infinite, you're not actually changing the totality of God's existence. That it changes the totality of my existence. I existed before and now I don't anymore. But it doesn't actually augment or change the totality of God's existence. But the implication of it actually is that what Spinoza believes, once you cease to exist, you cease to exist. That what you are is a finite mode of God's existence. And that because you are a finite mode that exists both in the attributes of thought and extension. Remember, you have both a mind and a body, and that those are parallel to each other. That when you stop existing, you simply stop existing as a finite mode in God. And that's what he writes here in the short treatise. He says, as man has created a finite thing, etc., it necessarily follows that what he has of thought and what we call the soul is a mode of the attribute we call thought, and that nothing else exists except this mode belongs to his essence. So much so that when this mode comes to naught, the soul perishes also, although the above attribute remains unchanged. The above attribute meaning the attribute of thought. The attribute of thought still exists, but you as a part of it, you as a mode of it, don't anymore. Similarly, as regards what he has of extension, of physical being, what we call body is nothing else than a mode of the other attribute, which we call extension. When this is destroyed, the human body also ceases to be, although the attribute extension remains unchanged. So Spinoza is denying two important traditional Jewish doctrines here. One is the doctrine of eternality of the soul, that the soul lives on eternally after you die. And the other one is the doctrine of resurrection of the dead, that at the end of times, you and your body will be resurrected when the Messiah comes. Spinoza denies both of those. He essentially says, when you die, you die. Your soul is the attribute of thought connected to your body, the attribute of extension, and the two cease to exist at the same time. And they will never come back into existence, he says. This is another thing, by the way, that got him excommunicated from the Jewish community, because he's denying several important traditional ideas. That being said, these are also things that have parallel within liberal Judaism today. There are many liberal Jews today who believe that there may not be eternality of the soul. There are many who believe that there may be, and there are many who believe that there may not be. And I think we'd be hard-pressed to find a lot of Reformed Jews who believe in resurrection of the dead at the end of times. So Spinoza, again, is anticipating what we call liberal Judaism, because we are in many ways products of what he's teaching here. And to Alex's second point about morality and society, remember we said before that Spinoza is a determinist. He writes, nothing in nature is contingent. I'm right here. But all things are from the necessity of the divine nature, determined to exist and act in a definite way. He believes that things happen because they are determined by their causes to happen in that way. So what does that mean about morality? Well, this is kind of interesting what he says here about free will. I'm right here, a baby. A baby thinks that it freely seeks milk, an angry child that it freely seeks revenge, and a timid man that he freely seeks flight. Again, the drunken man believes that it is from the free decision of the mind that he says what he later, when sober, wishes he had not said. So too, a delirious man, the gossiping woman, the child, and many more of this sort think that they speak from free mental decision when in fact they are unable to restrain their torrent of words. So Spinoza says, you think you have free will. Are you really free? Are you not acting in ways that are determined by your mood? As we said before, your mood and your current state of mind and what your parents taught you and the traumas of your past and the traumas of your grandparents who were Holocaust survivors and the part of the world that you were born into and your socioeconomic status, are those not the determinants of you? Can you really say that you have free will when all these things are conspiring to determine how you will act? So he says. All right, I see Carla's hand. Go ahead, Carla.
Rabbi, you skipped over the part that's immediately before that, where he's saying that we can make choices, but only when we hold our desires in moderation, kind of like the Greeks thing in medias res, or, you know, where you don't, no extremes. You can make good choices when you don't have, when your emotions aren't in control.
So he's actually saying that that's what we think. He says we think that we can make choices when our emotions are held in check, but actually we are, you know, even when we're holding our emotions in check, we're still being determined by causes, because the way you think is still determined by the way your parents thought, or again, what you were taught yesterday morning in school or whatever. So he says, don't think that just because you can moderate your passions means you have free will. You don't, because your actions are still being determined by all these things. And in that sense, he's actually, again, anticipating neuroscience of the 21st century, which says that both emotion and what we would call rational thought, they're both things happening in different areas of your brain. You can't separate necessarily them from you. And to imagine that somehow you can separate out your emotions and make decisions rationally, as if your emotions are something that exists outside you, or it doesn't make sense. What he essentially says is these are all causes within us, even if we think that they're separate. Let me ask you all a question. We had talked about breaking into breakout rooms, but I see there's still more hands here. By a show of hands, how many would like to continue the discussion, the discussion that we're having here, and take questions? I'll ask that first. And the second one is how many would like to go into breakout rooms and have a smaller discussion? So raise your hand if you'd like to continue in our larger discussion here. Okay, and for those who would like to go into breakout rooms, if you can raise your hand. Okay, so I'm not seeing a lot for the breakout room. So if it's okay, we'll just continue this discussion here. And anybody who'd like to say something, please go ahead and raise your hand. So I see Peter and Joy, and then I want to talk a little more about Alex's second question, which will also lead us to next week's discussion. Vanix, go ahead.
I just want to make 2 points. One about the we were talking about previously, where the body ceases to exist and the mind ceases to, and the soul ceases to exist, being the repudiation, if you will, of the basic tenets of Judaism at that time. The other one that is being repudiated very clearly in my mind in that proposition, I'm not sure whether that's the right word, but is the concept of Olam Haba, of there being a world to come, which is going to be better than the world we're in. So I mean, I see that as another reason why perhaps Spinoza was kicked out of the tribe.
Right, because there is no other plane of existence, right? This is it. This plane of existence is what there is, and so therefore there can be nowhere else to go, so to speak, that exists outside of the laws of nature. Sorry,
but
Peter.
that would be also why he would have gotten kicked out of the Christian church, because they believe that when one dies, one goes to be with Jesus, which is a much better place than where you currently are.
Right. In fact, all three Abrahamic religions have some kind of a sense traditionally of a next world. And in Judaism, that takes two forms. It takes the form of the place where your soul goes after you die. And it also takes the form of the Messianic age, when essentially history will end and you will be resurrected and God will rule over the world. Well, Spinoza has in one fell swoop denied both of those. He says there is no eternality of the soul, and there is no resurrection or other plane of existence. Anything that's going to happen in history is going to happen in history, according to the laws of history and the laws of nature. Again, he's not so far off from what liberal Judaism teaches. So when the Reform movement writes about, we believe in a messianic era, that will exist, that we will bring a messianic era. They're essentially saying we don't believe in a personal Messiah or resurrection, or maybe even in eternality of the soul. We believe that whatever is going to happen here and now in this world, and we're going to bring it. So that's, in some ways, that's Spinoza plus Hermann Cohen. That's Spinoza's metaphysics plus Hermann Cohen's morality. But Spinoza certainly is laying the groundwork for what we call liberal Judaism, even though I don't think he ever knew he was doing that. So that's why we study him as Jews, even though it's not clear that he thought of himself as writing Jewish philosophy. So
the other
go ahead.
thing I wanted to ask about was in the last part that we just read, you made the point that he thought everything, all your experiences, that determines what you're doing. But in the last, having trouble seeing it, but the last couple of lines of that proof, he refers to your appetites, and I'm wondering if it may not be everything, but just your physical appetites, the need to eat, the need to sleep, the need to procreate. All those things those are the things that determine what you do.
Yeah, well, he means all of them. They're all, so you're looking at this part right here where it says, mental decisions are nothing more than the appetites themselves, varying therefore according to the varying disposition of the body. So when he's talking about causes, I've been defining them as things that came before us, but things happening in your body are also causes. If I pick up an apple and eat it, did I do that of my own free will, or did I do it because something in my body told me I need some sugar? Right? That's what he's asking, is that's an appetite happening inside of my body, which is determining what I do. Now, it might not determine that I eat the apple versus that thing. That might be determined by the fact that this week I'm limiting my carbs to 75. But why am I limiting my carbs this week? Because of this other thing that happened, because of this other thing that happened. So everything is determined by causes, he says. Where is there room for free will if everything is determined by causes? Now you might say, come on, what if I just decide right now to jump up, turn around 10 times and sit back down? Could you have anticipated that? Did I not choose that? And Spinoza would say, well, no, there are causes that led you to do that. Even that unexpected, spontaneous thing that you did is determined by cause. They made you the kind of person who would ask, what if I did that right now? Right? What causes led you to be that? And this raises questions about ethics and morality, where we said before, and I'm not going to read all this, but you can read through it yourself. He essentially says good and evil are what he calls things that exist in reason, as opposed to real things that exist really, which is to say they are things that we perceive. Good and evil are here. Thus we say that a man is bad only in comparison with one who is better, or also that an apple is bad in comparison with one that is good or better. Where do you draw the line between the bad person and the good person? I think we can all agree, who's on the bad end. Mother Teresa's on this end, and certain people are on this end. But what about in the middle? Where's the line between what's good and what's bad? He says these are societal decisions that we're making in determination, in subjectively, where one person is put up against another to decide who is good and who is bad. Therefore, can we really say that something is good or bad objectively, or are good and bad more about how it seems to us as people or as society? But he says, here's where there is room for ethics. Each thing, insofar as it is in itself, endeavors to persist in its own being. In other words, all things want to continue to exist. You might say, what about the person who is depressed, who wishes to take their own life or something like that? And Spinoza would answer there again that there's some cause that has caused that person to be not well, that causes them to behave in that way, but that a thing or a person that is existing in a well sense in the universe, endeavors to persist in its own being. And if we use the faculty of reason, the good which every man who pursues virtue aims at for himself, he will also desire for the rest of mankind, and all the more as he acquires a greater knowledge of God. In other words, if we are reasonable, he says, now you can agree or disagree, if we are reasonable, then I will want what's best for you just as I want it for me. This sounds a little bit to me like love your neighbor as yourself, right? This is actually a religious postulate that he's putting here into scientific language, that if we follow the faculty of reason, then we will all love our neighbor as ourselves. We will want what is best for each other, and not only for ourselves, because it is reasonable to do so. And all the more so as we acquire a greater knowledge of God, that the more you know about God and the universe and nature, the more you will know, the more you will want what is best for all of us. And society, to Alex's point, society is built around the idea that we all want what's best for each other. Therefore, I'm going to give up a little bit of my rights, and you're going to give up a little bit of your rights, so that we can have a society or a community together, because community is ultimately what is best for us. And in that sense, he's anticipating what would become called social contract theory 100 years later. And social contract theory of for example, Rousseau, is essentially what sits at the center of liberal democracy. So that's our segue into next week, which is to say that not only does Spinoza anticipate liberal Judaism, but he actually also anticipates liberal democracy. He tells us that this is the most reasonable type of government and type of society that can exist, and this is provable from the laws of nature as he'd laid them out here. So I see Karen's hand, and then I'll just wrap up and segue us to next week.
He talks about pursuing virtue, but isn't virtue subjective and relative? What's considered virtuous by one group in society might not be in another, or over time, definitions of virtue might change. Does he talk about absolute virtues?
Oh, that's so postmodern of you, Karen. But it's a good question, and I don't know exactly the answer to that question, but my sense of it is that he does believe that virtue is subjective, in the sense that we are deciding, as he said a moment ago, we are deciding what's good and what's bad, but that there is, if you remember from last week, there is a sort of an ultimate true good. And that true good is learning about the world around you and understanding how you are part of a larger whole, and that, that doesn't change over time. And that societies are essentially built around the idea, as I said a moment ago, that I want what's best for me, and you want what's best for you, and I also want what's best for you, and you want what's best for me. So that although certain ideas of virtue may change over time, that will always remain the same, and we will always be able to work together as a society to determine or to make sure that everybody gets what's best for them. It's very optimistic, as regards human nature, but it does sit in many ways at the center of the kind of society that we have, that even as our needs and as our desires evolve over time, we trust in the will of the people to create a government that will ultimately do what's best for the people. It's really the founding notion of democracy. So actually with that, we'll segue into next week. When we meet next week, we're going to talk about Spinoza's political philosophy, and which we've actually just hinted about here, and about his approach to religious life. The question of how do you read the Bible, and the question of what does it mean to be religious? Does ritual matter? Does religion matter? And how does community matter? So I'll invite you to read the rest of the pamphlet that I handed out, going from. We made our way up today up through page 19, so you can read page 20 through the end, and we'll pick up that discussion when we meet again next week. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your questions and your discussion, and I'll look forward to seeing you all again next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was
Wow, thank you
fantastic.
both
Thank you,
kindly.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
We're now thoroughly confused.